This is a retrospective on Kenny vs. Spenny. The following clips are sanctioned under the fair use policy for the purpose of commentary and education. Kenny vs. Spenny is an Entertainment One production brought to you by Comedy Central and Showcase. Please support Kenny vs. Spenny by watching their episodes on YouTube or checking out their live performances. And if you're so inclined, they have a merch store. Anything you could do to help support these guys, especially Spenny. He really needs it.
What does it mean for a piece of entertainment to have a cult following? Whenever the term is brought up, I usually think of a television show, movie, video game, etc. that was initially overlooked, but found an audience years later. That could be out of genuine love and appreciation like the game Earthbound, or out of ironic enjoyment like the movie Troll 2. Either way, the eventual audience for whatever piece of media helped breathe new life into it and made it culturally relevant years later. With that said, movie series like Star Wars or the Marvel Cinematic Universe could be viewed as cult films, even though they obviously saw a lot of success right away. This is because, yeah, a lot of people watch them, but there are a certain subset of fans who have analyzed them front to back, knowing every line of dialogue, sequence of events, and even outside lore that is completely absent from the finished products. The cult audience for those properties may not have been the entire reason for the success of the products, but they made damn sure that the work stayed relevant in pop culture, and the impact and influence of them were never forgotten. Point is, whether the audience is big or small, and the work in question was successful or unsuccessful, cult followings play a big part in keeping art alive and relevant over a long period of time. However, what if I told you that there was a cult show that was extremely successful upon its release, but at the same time got completely ignored in popular culture? A show that was often written off as juvenile, unintelligent garbage that nowadays is being microanalyzed frame by frame by a large community of people 20 years after its initial premiere. If you read the title of this video, you might already know that there is a show exactly like that, and it's called Kenny vs. Spenny. For those of you who don't know, Kenny vs. Spenny is a Canadian comedy reality series that ran for 6 seasons on several different networks from 2003 to 2010. The show was a huge success in Canada and migrated to many other countries, but more on that later. I was growing up around the time that the show was airing, and when I say the show had a dedicated cult following, I mean it really did. You couldn't throw a rock in my junior high school without it hitting someone that was probably into Kenny vs. Spenny. This success didn't even end when the show finished its run. To this day, Kenny and Spenny still tour around Canada and other countries frequently, and often play to sold-out crowds. The fanbase for the show on the internet is quite pumping too, with entire YouTube channels, Reddit communities, and Discord servers dedicated to people examining, analyzing, and memeing this show to hell and back. Not only has the fanbase for Kenny vs. Spenny not died down over the years, if anything, it has blown up far beyond what it was during its quote-unquote peak. I wholeheartedly admit that I was, and still am, among the crowd that thinks Kenny vs. Spenny is one of the funniest TV shows I've ever seen. While I'm much more diverse in my entertainment consumption today, there was a good year-long period of time when I was around 14 or so, where the only 2 television shows I'd watch were South Park and Kenny vs. Spenny. I've seen every episode anywhere from 3 to 30 times each, and know plenty of the episodes beat for beat, both in terms of plot and many of the lines. I've also had the chance to see Kenny and Spenny live on 2 occasions, one only being a few months ago, which I also thought were great. But why has the show garnered such a dedicated cult following? From the outside looking in, Kenny vs. Spenny may or may not be funny to the average person, but is there anything deeper than that? Yes, it's edgy and it pushed the boundaries, but so did South Park, Jackass, and Family Guy, so how does Kenny vs. Spenny stand out in that regard? Well, I don't claim to speak for everyone, but I do certainly have my own take on why this show has struck such a chord, while at the same time gone completely unnoticed in many circles. This video is going to analyze what I feel the essence of Kenny vs. Spenny is, and what made the show so special to so many people. Before I get ahead of myself, let's talk about what Kenny vs. Spenny actually is. The show follows 2 childhood friends, Kenny Hotz and Spencer Rice, who compete in ridiculous competitions for the sake of punishing the other person through making them perform a humiliating act. Instead of describing every competition in detail, let me just say a few episode titles to give you a basic idea of what they were like. Who can blow the biggest fart? Who can bone more women? Who can 69 the longest? Who can smoke more weed? Who can drink more beer? Who can keep a dead octopus on their head the longest? Who can keep a dump in their pants the longest? And the list goes on. Some of these competitions were crazy, some of them were brutal, some of them were humiliating, and almost all of them were downright hilarious. The first season aired on the CBC in Canada, where it felt more like a straightforward competition-style show with elements of comedy mixed within it. However, with the show being as raunchy as it was, it didn't quite mix well with the CBC's target audience, so Kenny vs. Spenny was moved over to the much more adult-oriented network Showcase, where it got crazier and crazier. I will say that while I like Season 1, I do not think it really represents the show as a whole very well. There are still a lot of great episodes like Who Can Stay Awake the Longest, Who Can Stay Handcuffed the Longest, and Who Can Stay Blindfolded the Longest, but the season as a whole seems a lot tamer and a lot more straightforward than the rest of the series. That doesn't make it bad. In fact, I could see someone picking Season 1 as their favorite season for those very reasons. Still, I'd maybe check out a few episodes from later seasons if you've seen a few episodes from Season 1 and didn't really get into them. The most common comparison that Kenny vs. Spenny gets is Jackass, which is totally understandable. Both shows see their stars engaging in disgusting and humiliating acts that really push the boundaries of what was acceptable on television. I enjoy Jackass, but Kenny vs. Spenny has a distinct difference that I feel elevates the humor even further. When the Jackass crew are doing their stunts, they take pride and enjoyment in hurting themselves and getting pranked. There's nothing wrong with that approach, but it does definitely generate a lot of humor to see them laughing throughout the pain. What's clear to see from watching Kenny vs. Spenny is that the stars get no enjoyment out of being hurt or humiliated. Quite the opposite, in fact. The entire point of their show is to make the other person suffer. I find this dynamic much more interesting and satisfying than seeing a bunch of guys take enjoyment out of getting hit in the balls. It adds to the pain and suffering of Kenny vs. Spenny, which in turn adds to the comedy. Kenny and Spenny are still willingly putting themselves through these situations, mind you. It's not like they can't say no to a competition or a humiliation if they think it goes too far for them. That doesn't mean they're enjoying it in the moment though, but they obviously know that their suffering is worth it because it's funny. However, in terms of their comedic dynamic, I can't really think of any sort of duo that does the exact same thing as Kenny vs. Spenny. About the closest comparison I can make is Ricky Gervais and Carl Pilkington. An Idiot Abroad is a show that I think actually shares a few similarities to Kenny vs. Spenny. If you haven't seen it, it's essentially about Carl Pilkington traveling to different parts of the world on a trip organized by Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant. Basically, Ricky Gervais uses the entire production and format of the show itself to screw with Carl Pilkington's head. He and Stephen Merchant pre-plan a lot of the situations on Carl's journey, tailor-made to piss him off. This is very similar to how Kenny uses the format of a competition to screw with Spenny's head. Watching Kenny vs. Spenny for the purposes of seeing a straightforward competition is kind of like watching An Idiot Abroad for the purpose of watching a straightforward travel show. I've often heard Carl Pilkington described as the best comedian who isn't really a comedian. I think that same sort of logic also could apply to Kenny, and especially Spenny. There are a lot of things that make Kenny vs. Spenny stand out amongst the crowd, which is both a blessing and a curse. It's great that there's nothing quite like it, but at the same time, that's a problem within the industry. As successful and popular as Kenny vs. Spenny is, networks are reluctant to greenlight a continuation for such an out-there concept for a television show. About the closest we've come so far is their one-off 2020 special Paldemic. This is because executives tend to like to have something to compare yourself to whenever you pitch a show to prove that what you are doing can be a success. Since there are so few things, if any, that compare to Kenny vs. Spenny, it's hard to have a proof of concept in the current year to prove that the show will still reach an audience, even if Kenny and Spenny are consistently selling out their live shows. This is also a big reason why Kenny vs. Spenny isn't respected more amongst big players in the comedy industry. There's nothing to compare themselves to. If you do stand-up, there are other stand-up comedians. If you write for sitcoms, there are certainly a lot of other sitcoms. Kenny and Spenny don't really have that. Is the television show a sitcom? Maybe in a loose manner, but it has no script. Is it a prank show like Tom Green or Jackass? In a way, but it's much more driven by a narrative to be compared to unrelated vignettes. Is their live act a stand-up? Sort of, but they aren't writing bits or putting on a performance. Kenny has stated in interviews that he really dislikes any sort of comparison, and it's pretty clear to see why. That's not to say that there aren't a few people that have recognized Kenny and Spenny's genius throughout the years. The biggest example of this, of course, being Matt Stone and Trey Parker, who produced the show in the later seasons and hired Kenny temporarily to be a writer on South Park. Kenny also made a small cameo in the movie Zack and Miri Make a Porno, so I guess Kevin Smith likes him too. Generally speaking though, Kenny and Spenny have more or less stayed on their own island and haven't collaborated with many other people outside of their own production crew. Another reason I feel Kenny vs. Spenny isn't respected more is because of its secondary label that it always receives, that being a reality show. Usually when someone hears the term reality show, at least someone with good taste in television, their mind immediately goes to a bunch of pedantic and highly dramatized trash television shows that end up feeling faker than a scripted show due to their highly produced nature. Kenny vs. Spenny is not that. It's a reality show, but at the same time, it's the quintessential anti-reality show. It's dogmatic, in your face, and doesn't sugarcoat anything. That's not to say nothing is pre-planned, because obviously some stuff is, but that's not the same as being fake. On that note, I guess it's time to bring up the one thing that everybody has to bring up whenever they talk about Kenny vs. Spenny. Is the show fake? I don't want to spend too much time on this discussion, but I will give my own thoughts on the matter. I believe that Kenny vs. Spenny is real, at least most of the time. I know that people have pointed to specific instances where they call out a scene or scenario in Kenny vs. Spenny that at the worst seems staged, and at best seems like a reshoot. I'm not going to delve into those instances, but I will say that to me, there are some of them that seem real, and some of them that do seem a little bit fabricated. There's a great YouTube channel called Spamerica, who has done a series on Kenny vs. Spenny that delves a lot more into the legitimacy of some of the more contentious instances. I'll leave a link to his channel in the video description, which you should really check out if you're a big Kenny vs. Spenny fan. I agree with his overall take on the matter, that being that I am convinced that Kenny vs. Spenny is real, and I think that claiming otherwise, even as a fan, is doing a massive disservice to the show. I often hear the sentiment that if Kenny vs. Spenny was fake, then it wouldn't matter because the show would still work as a funny scripted show. Much like Spamerica, I believe that rhetoric goes completely against what the show is, and I know that Kenny would agree with me on that too. I guarantee you that a huge part of why the show works, as well as it does, is because Kenny and Spenny are real people, and this is their real relationship with each other. Going back to Carl Pilkington, you could also make the claim that certain parts of An Idiot Abroad are heightened for comedy, if not fabricated, and you'd probably be right. Obviously, when you produce a television show, even one based on reality, the end product is undoubtedly going to come out as, well, produced. It doesn't matter to me though, because at the core of An Idiot Abroad, there's a very real relationship between Carl and Ricky, who are two very real people. The same thing applies to Kenny vs. Spenny. I said it before, but it bears repeating now, pre-planned does not mean fake. Anyone who thinks that's the case does not understand how productions work. Whenever you watch a documentary, even the most grounded, realistic, and accurate ones, there is still so much writing, outlining, and pre-production that goes into making that documentary a reality. You need to outline the goal of your documentary before you can get funding, so you obviously need a certain level of pre-production that goes into that. If you want to say that Kenny vs. Spenny is overproduced, I guess I can understand your argument there even if I disagree. However, that does not mean that it's fake. Do I think that Kenny and Spenny are the exact same off-camera as they are on-camera? I would say no, at least not all the time. Kenny and Spenny both know that the conflict between each other is what works for the show, so they undoubtedly play into that aspect of their relationship a lot. That doesn't mean that it's fake, so much that it means that they're highlighting one very real element of their relationship, in this case the most toxic element of it, because that's what's funny. If you watch their documentary Pitch, which they worked on before Kenny vs. Spenny, you can definitely tell that they are essentially the same people, with the one exception being that they are working towards the same goal rather than competing with each other. This movie shows that there is some genuine love and camaraderie beneath all the insults, manipulation, and anger. Anyone who has watched a lot of Kenny vs. Spenny knows this all too well. You also see elements of the more loving side of their friendship on several different occasions throughout the show. The best example of this is the episode Who Can Smoke More Weed. Here, Kenny and Spenny forego their usual routine of trying to destroy the other person in favor of hanging out and having fun. They can't bring themselves to truly get angry at each other because they're both way too high. It's actually really funny that the concept for this episode was built up as a crazy, edgy special event at the time, and in retrospect, it's actually one of the sweetest and more wholesome episodes of the series. As a side note, I think Spenny's persona when he's drunk, compared to when he gets really high, is a great case to why marijuana should be legalized. Now that I've talked about why the show is so niche, let's examine why it was also so popular. For me personally, the biggest part of why the show is such a hit is because of the personalities of Kenny and Spenny themselves. Kenny is a prankster, liar, and manipulator who often cheats in order to gain a victory over Spenny. Spenny is a straightforward, by-the-books competitor who cares less about who does the humiliation and more about it being on the books that he competed fairly and ultimately triumphed over Kenny on a technical level. The fundamental differences between who these two people are, why they do what they do, and what they believe constitutes as a victory over the other person is a really huge part of what makes Kenny vs. Spenny shine. When longtime friends enter a creative partnership with each other, it often leads to a fallout, be that from creative differences, financial inadequacies, or plain getting sick of each other's presence. Kenny and Spenny actually use this to their advantage. Instead of desperately trying to preserve their friendship from becoming tarnished, these two actively tried to destroy their relationship on a global scale for our amusement. Since the show was set up in a way that incentivizes them to fight with each other, it feels natural and organic for them to completely want to conquer the other guy. The disconnect between Kenny and Spenny's motivations sparks an ideological conflict that is present throughout the entire series. The difference in ideologies between these two is as old as time, which is why this show will always stay somewhat relevant, rather than being some flavor of the week forgettable comedy series. We should be rooting for Spenny to win, right? He's the underdog who doesn't cheat, keeps the integrity of the competition intact, and never backs down no matter how badly Kenny fucks with him. Well, given how long I've already spent rambling about this show, you can probably guess that things aren't so black and white. Kenny has often described the show as being happy versus unhappy in interviews, which Spenny vehemently disagrees with. He's further elaborated on this point by calling it I don't care versus I care, which I think is an interesting perspective. Obviously, Kenny does care on some level. He cares about making his fans laugh, humiliating Spenny, and delivering a great final product for the audience to enjoy. What Kenny doesn't care about is doing the competitions fairly, if at all, and being crowned as the technical winner of the competition. Which, are the exact things that Spenny cares about. Whenever Kenny tells a joke, it has two purposes. One, obviously, is to be funny, and two, is to get on Spenny's nerves. Therefore, even if Kenny's initial joke is funny, Spenny's irritated reaction to it makes it 5 times as funny. I've often heard Kenny state that he believes that many viewers will side with Spenny on their first viewings, but the more episodes they watch, the more they will side with Kenny. Yes, Spenny is the one going through the competitions as stated, and taking them seriously, but the show isn't really about seeing who wins, so much as it is seeing about how it plays out. This goes back to Kenny's I don't care versus I care philosophy. Kenny doesn't care about proving that he can drink more beer or sit on a cow longer than Spenny. His goal is to do anything that he can to get on Spenny's nerves and convince Spenny that he lost the competition, whether or not he actually did. Kenny is there to have fun, make jokes, and not take life seriously, which is exactly what makes him so lovable and relatable. On top of that, we more often than not want to see Kenny come out on top due to how much time and effort he puts into fucking with Spenny. You may say that Kenny is a cheater, but he certainly isn't a lazy cheater when it comes to his schemes. Episodes such as Who Can Catch a Bigger Fish, Who Can Stay Obese the Longest, and Who Can Sell More Bibles see Kenny pulling off elaborate Machiavellian schemes to fuck with Spenny's head. It doesn't even matter whether or not he's cheating, because he's putting so much effort into his plan that you can't help but be fascinated and want to see the scheme play out from beginning to end. Also, even though the show is called Kenny vs. Spenny, anyone can tell from watching it that Kenny is the one owning the production, providing the majority of the comedy, calling most of the shots, and molding the show into what it is. Hell, the show is built off the premise that if you cheat, you can still win, so long as the other guy doesn't catch you in the act. That's definitely a Kenny idea if I ever heard one, even if Spenny agreed to it. Is Spenny winning because he's doing the competitions fairly? Or is Kenny winning because Spenny is the one being humiliated more often than not? The show itself is clearly tipped more towards Kenny, considering Spenny's the one getting punished at the end of most of the episodes. Kenny has also ended up as richer and more successful than Spenny, so I think it's fair to say that he won the game of life as well. I obviously love Kenny. I mean, what Kenny vs. Spenny fan couldn't? He's the one driving the production, the comedy, and the craziness of the show, which makes the show as great as it is. That doesn't mean I also don't love Spenny in his own way, for his unrestrained anger, bizarre actions, and willingness to put himself through Kenny's shenanigans. If he's a loser, I'd definitely say that he's a lovable one, although lovable in a very weird way. In fact, this may be a controversial opinion among Kenny vs. Spenny fans, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I actually think Spenny is the funniest part of the show. Yep, you heard me right, but let me explain. The reason that Spenny is so funny is because Kenny knows exactly how to get on his nerves. Spenny's unhinged rants, built out of pent-up anger, make for some of the funniest outbursts I've ever seen, and this is coming from someone who has watched a lot of internet meltdowns. Spenny may be the one to do the competition by the books, but that doesn't make him a straight man in the traditional sense. He's such a bizarre, neurotic, angry, and miserable person, and Kenny really knows how to expose the more unhinged aspects of Spenny's character by torturing him. Spenny will often unapologetically say the most inane, embarrassing, and crazy things, without caring if he comes across as pretentious, self-righteous, or even downright foolish, which he often does. Maybe you love Spenny, maybe you hate him, maybe sometimes a little bit of both. Either way, I don't think that there's a single Kenny vs. Spenny fan on this planet who thinks the show would be as good as it is if Kenny was competing against anyone else. The episode Who Can Lift More Weight with Their Genitals is a great testament to that. In that episode, Spenny has a mental breakdown and leaves the show, and Kenny attempts to fill his spot with potential candidates, all of which fail to provide the same chemistry as Spenny. Spenny is trying his hardest to compete fairly in a show that rewards the competitors for cheating, lying, and manipulating the other person. Even though Spenny isn't a traditional straight man, he definitely grounds the show by sticking so close to his principles while in the competition. If Kenny and Spenny were both using underhanded tactics to one-up each other, then it wouldn't really work. We need someone like Spenny to follow the rules, otherwise it wouldn't be so funny when Kenny breaks them. To quote a therapist from the episode Who is Saner,
Kenny is a flame, and that flame burns. And it burns people close to him, and Spenny feels like the log that's being burned. Without the log, there is no flame.
I think the show gets better the more you watch it for several reasons. The more episodes you watch, the more you understand Kenny and Spenny's relationship on a deeper level. You really get the sense that these two go back for years, and a big part of the reason the show works as well as it does is because they know practically everything about one another. The best way to demonstrate this is by talking about the show's many remakes. You see, the format of Kenny vs. Spenny was so popular that the two actually got deals to have their show remade in other countries. This led to a long line of clone shows including Ed vs. Spencer in England, Elton vs. Simon in Germany, Sid vs. Varen in India, Juan vs. Roman in Colombia, and many more. Try as they may, the remakes of Kenny vs. Spenny never saw the same amount of success as the original series. You could get the two most talented comedians in the world to compete against each other in ridiculous competitions, and while that may very well lead to some very funny moments, it's not going to have the same impact as two people who knew each other from their early childhood. There are many times in the series where Kenny and Spenny delve into their past resentments, which motivates a lot of their decision making. An example of this is when Kenny doses Spenny with 4 hits of LSD, due to Spenny doing the same thing to Kenny when they were in grade 9. That's something that could never be replicated, at least not accurately, unless the competitors knew each other for that long. The TV series has many other stories of Kenny and Spenny's past sprinkled throughout, and their live show is pretty much nothing but Kenny digging into Spenny for his actions when they were younger. This not only sparks a lot of funny moments, but it adds a level of relatability to Kenny and Spenny's dynamic. I'm sure we all have memories of screwing with our friends from our childhood, and Kenny and Spenny are basically stuck in this dynamic for all eternity. In the end, Kenny vs. Spenny's success lies in a lot of the same reasons it never reached a wider market. It pushed the envelope, and many of the episodes are still really abrasive even now. Of course, in the much more sensitive world we live in today, it would be incredibly difficult to get this type of content on television. Their approach to their comedy is dogmatic, visceral, and grounded, which doesn't really fly in the industry full of plastic entertainment that we live in. There really aren't many entertainers now, or even back in 2003, who will go the extra mile to suffer the way that Kenny and Spenny did for their comedy. On top of that, Kenny vs. Spenny is a comedy series about two guys who are real people. Incredibly bizarre people to be sure, but real guys who just so happen to have the perfect comedic dynamic. On the surface, it's the most simplistic, juvenile, and crass comedy imaginable, and beneath the surface, it's the most layered, intelligent, and complex comedy imaginable. I think it went over a lot of people's heads, including many television broadcasters and people within the comedy industry. That's not to say there aren't legitimate reasons to dislike the show, and that's okay too. I can definitely see Kenny vs. Spenny not being someone's type of humor. However, I will say that even if you don't find the show funny or enjoyable, I still think that there's a lot to appreciate about it due to its uniqueness, ballsy approach to comedy, and exploration of two competing philosophical ideologies. The whole sequence of events that led to Kenny vs. Spenny's existence were a total lightning in the bottle scenario. It never happened before, and will likely never happen again. The reason it comes across as fake to a lot of people is because it all seems too good to be true. In a way, people who claim that the show is fake are actually complimenting Kenny vs. Spenny, albeit in a backhanded way. Kenny is often pushed for the show to get a revival in recent years. I would love to see that happen, as I'm sure many would. That does seem unrealistic to me though, I must admit. Kenny has tried to upload the entire series to YouTube many times, but it keeps getting pulled due to its offensive nature. I agree that the series does not align with YouTube's restrictions. In other words, the series is way too awesome to be on YouTube, and it might be too awesome for any other television or streaming service as well. Even if you could find a network that is willing to push the boundaries as far as Kenny vs. Spenny did, their brand of comedy is so unique that it's really hard to articulate it to a broadcaster. Even in an entertainment industry plagued by reboots of different properties, and with their live show selling out repeatedly, a Kenny vs. Spenny revival would be very tricky. I'm also not sure if Kenny and Spenny could even survive another season given their age and physical shape, but I sure as hell would love to see them try. If I've convinced a few people to watch this show with this video, then I feel like I've done my job as a Kenny vs. Spenny fan. Consider this a video as a call to arms to get Kenny vs. Spenny Season 7 greenlit. Go check it out and see why it has such a dedicated cult following, and who knows, maybe that will lead to more projects for them down the road. Whether you love it or hate it, I almost guarantee you'll get a strong reaction out of Kenny vs. Spenny, for better or for worse.
Special thanks to our Patreon supporters, including Hilly and Bran, for supporting this channel. If you'd like to support us as well, I will post the links in the video description to donate to our channel on Patreon or PayPal. Also, join our Discord server to talk to us and our community. If you feel so inclined, make sure to slap that like button, mock us in the comments, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification button, and share this video with your friends. All these things can help our channel grow, and if you'd made it this far, I thank you so much. Have a great day, you beautiful person. Also, if you've made it this far in the video, you might realize that there's another guy working on these videos now. That would be me. Ian has handed off me, Uno Aphex, the Headless Gamer, as the editor for the videos going forward. And that being said, please refer yourself to our patrons in the next list.